speaker. We are also joined by Tarjinder Gill, who is a primary school teacher, and we are joined by Calvin Robinson, who is a school governor and former assistant principal. So we are going to get straight into it. I'll just say a brief statement about how the format will be. So the panelists will first give their introductory statements, and we will then have a discussion, and we will close with questions from the audience. So please, we want to read and engage with the things that you're thinking about in relation to the discussion. So please comment, add your commentary and add questions. So we are first going to go to Alka, please.
Okay, thank you, Inaya. Okay, so I think these terms, decolonising education, is taken for granted today. It's like their aggregated meanings are assumed to be something morally worthwhile because it's said to be in the cause of correcting existing injustices and thereby contributing to greater equality. And who doesn't want greater equality, right? So it kind of has a spontaneous appeal. But I think before I make my case against it, I want to have a look at what the two main concepts in themselves mean. So what is A, the curriculum, and what is B, decolonising? Well, curriculum is what we as a society decide needs to be maintained and passed on to the next generation through a system of education. It's also, more specifically, it's a selection of knowledge that is taught by professionals in specific sites, educational institutions from nursery schools to universities. Now, the knowledge tradition in education in Anglo-American societies since the Enlightenment has been to select that knowledge which has been produced by specialised disciplinary procedures, usually, but not exclusively, within academia. It's different to both knowledge produced by non-specialised social experience or everyday knowledge, and it's also different to knowledge that has been authorised by divine revelation or divine theological cosmology prevailed. Now, school subjects are a further selection from disciplinary knowledge, and they're often combined with other knowledge, such as developmental theories of language and learning, as well as hybrid forms of knowledge. For example, classroom organisation or pedagogic strategies for teaching. So they're hybrid in that they include both theory and experience. So this definition, this very general definition of curriculum, is what has been tacitly endorsed through democratic politics and elections in Britain for the best part of the last century. Now, decolonisation is a concept that usually refers to a social political process by which a country is no longer governed by an economically, military and politically more powerful country, and the corresponding asymmetric relations of power are disrupted. So thus understood, it's difficult to see how the two main terms are connected. They seem completely different things, and yet our contemporary cultural, academic and educational institutions kind of take it for granted today, and increasingly private businesses as well. It's taken for granted that they go together like the proverbial horse and carriage. And if they don't go together, then there's a strong moral imperative that they should. And I want to sort of look at why some think that it is. Why is it that they seem to go together in a natural, spontaneous, common sense way? And I think here, the key assumption is that the power relations of decolonisation bear an isomorphic relationship to the hierarchical relationships in education, and more specifically, in the production and transmission of knowledge. So the powers of government, armies, NGOs, banks and corporations, through which the independence of weaker nations can be suppressed, are accepted as analogous to the power of professors, department heads, head teachers and teachers. The appropriation of raw materials through the historical development of colonialism is said to be analogous to the appropriation of indigenous knowledge itself, which some say is transported to Western sites where value is added and greater prestige and status is gained by the individuals and institutions in the West who have been complicit with this unidirectional relation of power. Those advocating decolonising curricula claim the knowledge under these socio-cultural conditions can't help but be a tool of oppression, just like the possession of superior military equipment or greater financial capital. And while the external aspects of decolonisation may have been largely achieved in the political struggles for independence in the post-war period, the internal aspects of decolonisation, they say, have not. Therefore, we need to decolonize our minds, and one of the functions of education is to shape minds. And so the appeal of the idea of decolonizing the curriculum to wider sections of the profession lies, in my view, in an intuitive sense of disappointment and pessimism. The promise of greater equality via forms of democracy in both Western and non-Western societies has not been fulfilled, and there's a kind of political pessimism. Now, wherever one stands politically, there's one central problem with the decolonizing discourse, which is a huge problem for education. And that is that knowledge is not a commodity like raw materials. It is constructed by human intellectual and imaginative effort, and it's a hybrid product, a product which synthesizes the best and most generalizable concepts wherever they are found. And disciplinary knowledge itself is not Western, Eastern, Black, British, Nigerian, although the cognitive products of people from East, West, Black, White, Brown, or British or Nigerian will have contributed to the development of such knowledge. And it's the task of guardians of scholarly knowledge to protect the truth value of knowledge from political pressures that want to bend knowledge to tell a particular story. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that the guardians in Britain today have been at best very sleepy and at worst highly negligent and cowardly in the face of external pressures to treat education as an instrument for external goals. True, access to such knowledge is not equally distributed among all our young. This is a matter of political will. Do we want to pay for the buildings, the materials, the playing fields, the concert halls, etc., that all children should have access to? It's also a cultural or educational matter. Do we value such knowledge, truthful knowledge, enough to pay for the education of teachers so they are best able to pass it on, irrespective of any imputed secondary gains, such as employability, personal happiness, or even being a better anti-racist? Does the public value it enough financially and morally support such an education system, even if on an individual level one's own child may not get a great job, an Oxbridge offer, or live in a trendy gentrified area, or may even be unhappy when confronted with the inevitable moments of uncertainty and failure and upset that can cause when trying to get to grips with such knowledge? These, I would argue, are much greater problems for the majority of all pupils of all ethnicities than whether the curriculum is decolonised. Decolonising the curriculum takes race to be real, because if it weren't, anti-racism would lack a justification. It's what Brett St. Louis, an academic at Goldsmith, calls pragmatic race essentialism. But the theory does not take truthful knowledge to be real. The result is we get explanations of social phenomena, including the one you mentioned, Inaya, at the beginning. Why is there a low take-up of some subjects? That relies, these explanations rely on exerting ethical pressure and policing rather than winning epistemological authority through empirical evidence and or logical reasoning. And I want to kind of come to an end with a concrete example. Take the low take-up of history GCSE by Black pupils, which is currently being interpreted by a section of the profession through the single variable of race. In 2007, Kay Trail's article in Teaching History, "You Should Be Proud of Your History, They Made Me Feel Ashamed," relays these words from a young interviewee. "When we were speaking about Black history, I became really involved as it had something to do with me as a person. With white history, there is nothing I can relate to, and it is so distant and far away from me." This was used uncritically by current head of department at a recent local authority sponsored webinar for professional development. The idea of emotional or personal involvement or lack of it is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. It's not just a temporary feeling, but it's imputed with cognitive and longer lasting dispositional powers as well. It's given more causal weight in the accounting for educational choices and outcomes than the experience and disciplinary knowledge of teachers themselves or cultural and family expectations of different subjects. So from this, you would assume that pupils might avoid a subject because it is whitewashed or Eurocentric, but it could be that pupils are put off because it's been reshaped to meet the requirements of diversity, and it ends up emphasising the unique special contributions of Black people in ways that may not ring true. And this strategy can make some pupils feel even more othered. So, for example, it's notable that this head of department briefly mentioned some Bengali boys who said they wanted more British history exactly for this reason, to feel like they belonged. But this was swiftly passed over by the presenter So it seems that some minority experiences are more kind of worthy of note and attention than others. But the key point here is that it isn't true. The whole basis of this doesn't really hold up to deeper scrutiny. In the same year, 2007, Cambridge Assessment's report of GCSE take-ups showed that Caribbean and African pupils combined take-up of history GCSE was 44.18%. White British pupils using history was 31.46%. Or conversely, 68.54% of white British pupils did not choose history, compared to 55.82% of black pupils who did not choose history. Now, if we go with the idea that choice of subject is a proxy for discriminatory lack of representation, then we could plausibly argue that discrimination and lack of representation is also the reason why the majority of white pupils don't choose history. But this possibility is, of course, not countenanced. And if you raise it in many educational forums, you run the risk of informal or formal censure for being racist. So what we're facing is a situation where radical changes are being proposed in the curriculum, which are funded and given official sanction on the basis of a claim that is at best only partially true, and which rides roughshod over established procedures and standards by which beliefs are justified as truthful knowledge. And I think this can only end up exacerbating existing problems of cynicism and mistrust. And I think that's why decolonising the curriculum is a problem for us all. It doesn't mean the curriculum doesn't need improving, it certainly does. But we do need to retain and value the truth criteria that inheres in disciplinary knowledge. That's me.
Thank you very much, Alka. So now we are going to hear from you, Tarjinder, please.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the invite to this important discussion. Decolonising the curriculum is an empty slogan as far as I'm concerned. I stand by the idea that while this may make sense in a settler colony like South Africa, it is essentially a meaningless statement in a nation like the UK. And the whole statement falls apart by simply stating one fact: we did not decolonise ourselves, or we did not colonise ourselves. So we can't decolonise ourselves either. Neither is it the case that there was a singular education curriculum created at some point during the colonial period that we've been teaching since that time. The use of the slogan demonstrates an ignorance of the history of the education systems of the constituent nations in the UK, all of which have slightly different histories and different present states. Linked curriculum campaigns such as Why is My Curriculum White again fail to demonstrate an understanding that in the UK, we are living in a nation state that has, since the earliest settlement, been majority white by dint of history and not by design. This history cannot be pretended away due to the current makeup of the population of this nation state today. If one wishes to engage in curriculum debate and to be taken seriously, then one should at least demonstrate an understanding of the history, society, polity and economy of this nation, understanding how and why it's unique and distinct to other nations, regardless of the current more globalised world we live in, and how this is reflected in the current national curriculum in England and elsewhere. Presentist political agendas were, in my opinion, part of the reason for poor teaching in schools, regardless of the subject, since the 1970s. Empowerment through effective teaching of knowledge, regardless of the source of the knowledge, is a far more effective way of empowering individuals, and by extension the groups they belong to, than empowerment through racial or ethnic identity. Let's face it, the latter approach has been tried in the US since the late 1960s onwards, and there's no reason to believe its adoption here has been or will be any more successful than it was in the US. While critical race theorists and intersectionalists might be happy to resort to generalise from anecdotes to the whole education system, the truth is that we have quite a loose, not a prescriptive curriculum, in which many decisions are made at the level of the classroom teacher and the particular school that one is taught in. I have taught in schools in Birmingham, London, Leicester and Great Yarmouth, and now I'm back in the East Midlands. Each school had its own curriculum, and there were variations due to the schemes of work adopted. What is this current state of play nationally, really? Well, actually, there isn't the large-scale research we need from early years to Key Stage 3 on what specific content is being taught in English literature, history, geography and PSHE, which are the main subject areas that are focused on. We should have better education research in all sorts of areas, including those areas that have driven education reform in recent past, such as the efficacy of progressive teaching methods versus direct or explicit instruction methods, the impact of the skills-based curriculum versus a knowledge-rich approach, and whether approaches building self-esteem and identity through the curriculum are actually effective or even desirable. So take Black History Month, for example. It's been taught in some of the schools that I actually taught in. And yet there seems to be no research that I could find that actually said whether it had the desired impact on self-esteem or outcomes. That seems kind of ridiculous to me, you know, over the last like 40 years. There's also a worrying lack of understanding that the real issues facing both poor Black and white children in the system is poor reading and writing instruction. And without addressing this, more books by Black or other ethnic minority authors and more units on different groups in society are a simple superficial gloss that will enrich some consultants and authors, but do nothing to tackle inequality in education. That's not to say that we should dismiss all the issues raised. I do think it's important to ensure that we are not reinforcing single negative stereotypes about any group of people. We need to ensure that when we teach, we represent communities and nations fairly and honestly, and do not depict certain countries as backwards, for example. I recall a unit on India that I was teaching at one point in one school, where I was looking at poverty alone. And it didn't recognise the vast wealth disparities that existed in that nation. I agree it should not be down to me completely as an individual teacher to correct such errors, but those creating the resources in the first place need to do their research properly. However, it's not true to say that this does not happen or that things have not changed. For example, in my own time working for a large education resource company, I included so many non-European thinkers in many lessons, in many units that I was creating, including one on the theory of evolution. This was accepted and not challenged by the company at all, and has been taught in schools in this country. It's just that the children who learn this are very, very young. Schools can ensure much of what is seen as imbalance is corrected on the curriculum through debate and discussion internally. This does not, however, involve unthinkingly subscribing to the ideological stance behind the decolonizer curriculum movement. The academics and activists involved need to stop pretending they are in some neutral way describing and critiquing the education system and its flaws. Critical race theorists and intersectionalists are part of an ideological stance that is hard left and does not allow for internal debate and discussion on the assumptions underlying their beliefs and their ideas. There is a deep lack of scholarship and research based from where they derive their ideas. And there is something else also. There is a deep amorality in their desire to racially politicise even the youngest child without a thought to the impact this could have to them psychologically or emotionally on the child. And I say that as a primary school teacher. And it doesn't even recognise the impact it could have on their relationships with members of different races and ethnic groups, and the impact this would have on creating such divisions within schools themselves and society as a whole. We should, as teachers and educators, engage with this cult ideological stance for what it is, regardless of our own personal political beliefs, and remember that we serve in a democratic nation with an elected government. As gatekeepers to the education system, we need to ensure that when the ideas that we hold and that we present are ideas that meet the same standard, and do not simply allow ourselves to be bullied by the word racist, which is what it comes down to, into accepting ideas and beliefs the majority of the current population have not had outlined to them explicitly, and most would reject if they did. Ultimately, curriculum changes should be within the remit of the law and for the betterment of the child and society, and not for a small group of individuals wanting to enrich themselves economically, socially and politically after hijacking a recent tragic event in another nation?
Thank you very much, Tarjinder, very passionate, and thank you. So lots of questions when we come back. So Calvin, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be speaking with such respected figures on this issue, honestly. So where to start with this thing? I think you know, the hard left extremists, and let's be clear, they are extremists, are using techniques of the far right to kind of force their worldview onto the state education system. And racial superiority is once again being promoted as an objective truth in order to claim that, you know, white privilege is an experience for white pupils, whereas black pupils are at a natural disadvantage due to systemic racism. I think attempts to link genetics and racial supremacy have long been debunked. In fact, race is more of a social construct. Studies show that, you know, humans cannot be divided into biologically distinct subcategories. The study of human genetics challenges the traditional concept of different races of humans as biologically separate and distinct. However, the hard left activist groups such as Black Lives Matter, the Black Curriculum, they insist on perpetuating the myth of white supremacy. And what's worse is they're backed by a cross-party group of no less than 30 MPs. And these campaigns are pushing for schools to teach critical race theory in an attempt to kind of overcompensate for what they judge to be centuries of inequality. And these campaign groups would do well to critically assess CRT and to understand the potentially disruptive nature of it, having been initially designed off the back of, you know, assumptions that are simply untrue. So proponents of CRT claim white supremacy and racial power are maintained over time. And the core premise of this theory is an attempt to kind of redefine racism from prejudice or discrimination towards people based on their race to more of a binary subjective theory of structural or institutional power struggles between white people and non-white people. You know, the term BME, or Black and Minority Ethnic, lends itself to this theme by grouping all ethnic minority persons into a single homogeneous demographic, essentially made up, you know, by many ethnic groups, with the only similarity being that they're not white. And this lies at the very core of CRT, which perceives economic and social inequalities as an outcome of white privilege structures, which perpetuate the marginalization of people of color. So these far left activists are intent on pushing debunked pseudoscience into our schools via the curriculum, with campaigns such as decolonize the curriculum, you know, remove dead white men, make the curriculum more black, whatever that means, by teaching more black history. Again, what does that mean? As if history was, you know, to be divided on a syllabus based on race instead of key events. And these campaigns are labeling themselves as anti-racist, which sounds very benign, if not philanthropic. However, their manifestos expose their true intentions. So, you know, they refer to members as comrades. The Black Lives Matter website, for example, asks for a boycott of white capitalism, for activists to foster a queer affirming network, freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, to dismantle the patriarchal practice and proclaim that they want to disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. So these are socially Marxist policies. They have little or nothing to do with Black Lives Mattering. So what is being witnessed is semiotics. It's the creation of meaning. You know, it's hard left groups such as Black Lives Matter portraying something as a fact when it is at best a theory, which is of course the epitome of propaganda. The problem is it's beginning to reach our schools. So considering that hundreds of millions of lives lost to Marxist regimes over the centuries, it's really, is it a theory that we want to be teaching in schools, unchallenged on the curriculum? So CRT is manifested in schools as the bigotry of low expectations. Teachers are setting lower standards for students of color in order to give them a better chance, presumably, you know, by overcoming what they perceive to be a handicap. And what is a well-intentioned action turns out to be detrimental to the teaching and learning of all the young people involved. For instance, the No More Excuses campaign group, they want to campaign against disciplining Black children for kissing their teeth. I'm not going to do an example because I'm not very good at this, but you know, kissing your teeth is just as bad as sticking up a finger at a teacher. And you know, no educationalist should accept bad behavior on that level from any pupil, no matter their race or heritage. And evidence suggests that Black and minority ethnic pupils prosper when expectations are in fact raised and not lowered. Young people thrive on boundaries and high standards, as is evidenced by schools like Michaela Community School in Brent, which I happen to be a governor of. They have a high proportion of BME students, and there's an emphasis on strong discipline, and that is gaining them results, GCSE results, 4 times better than the national average. So while we all have all this going on, popular authors like Robin DiAngelo are opining accusations that time itself may even be racist, and we need to excuse pupils that are members of certain ethnicities from societal standards of good punctuality. The idea that clock time may be an oppressively racist construct. It's ludicrous, it's patronizing. But it's also a prime example of that soft bigotry that has no place in the British education system. If we take a look at the education stats for the last few academic years, we can see that actually Black African pupils are consistently outperforming white British pupils. In the last academic year, 2018/19, the average attainment 8 results, and that's like a measure of a pupil's average grades across 8 core subjects. For pupils of Black African origin, was 48% against 46% for white British. At the same time, reading, writing, and maths for primary children in the same school year, we saw Black African pupils at 67%, while white British pupils were at 65%. So if the English education system was institutionally racist, surely these results would be reversed. So while the system itself is demonstrably not racist, it seems that the hard left activists are campaigning to politicize the curriculum. Perhaps they themselves are unintentionally racist. So instead of lowering our standards in a patronizing attempt to support minorities, we need to do the opposite. We need to raise aspirations for all young people. Race plays a very insignificant role in the English education system. Therefore, to treat it as a priority is to further perpetuate the myth of racial superiority. And that is not what we ought to be doing.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Calvin. So yeah, now I've got some questions, and please, audience, if you have questions, and also panelists, if you would like to ask each other questions and develop on each other's points. So the first question that I have is for Alka. So would you say there isn't such a thing as kind of Western knowledge or kind of Western epistemology? Do you think that there can be certain forms of understanding the world or certain histories that can be distinctly placed within kind of ethnic or racial categories? Or do you just reject that idea outright?
Well, I mean, if you like, socially, yes, there's you could say there's knowledge that is associated with Western or particular national cultures because it's been developed in those institutions, and its concrete manifestation will be, will have details that are specific to that place and time. But the actual conceptual ideas, I mean, you take history, for me, there is just history, right? I don't think there is British history. I think you can have a history of British politics, a history of Nigerian politics or Indian politics, a history of British culture, Timbuktuan culture. So you get my point. And you can have better or worse history. And the better history will be the history where the interpretations have the broadest powers of generalization, where that means where they can cover as many different content coming from different approaches, and provide a more compelling account of an event that happens. Because I don't think anything in society happens from just one cause. You see, it's always multi-causal. So the better history will be the one that can account for the various causes, can evaluate and gauge the importance of make judgments, not present history as predetermined either through necessarily through class or race or gender. At any one moment there's possible outcomes, and it's not always given by people's race or skin what that outcome will be. So to answer your question, yes and no. Yes, kind of contingently, but fundamentally no. I think there's just knowledge.
So you said that, the point in kind of teachers and academics is to kind of preserve knowledge and truth. It shouldn't necessarily be a place of kind of activism. But what would you say to many of these kind of decolonize the curriculum activists who would say that essentially, you know, in their words, that the power structures are against, you know, are racist, and therefore if they use traditional political means or democratic means in order to further their ends, then the structures are against them, and therefore, you know, in order to create this anti-racist society, you know, children and education is really the place to be able to be a model for transforming society.
Sorry, can I just jump in a little bit there, if that's okay? Okay, it does seem to me that the most prominent people who are involved in this, they themselves seem to be middle and upper class. And sorry, like to come into this as a working class person, or like somebody from a working class background, it seems to me they have quite a lot of privilege themselves. So what exactly are they arguing? They're arguing for their own oppression, which they seem to have like created for themselves, in a system whereby they're not actually oppressed. They've actually got more power than a lot of people in this society. I look at some of these people who are arguing they've got no power, and it's all about, so apparently they have no power. There's privilege based on race, and I'm looking at them going, well, you're up in a different class altogether towards me, and we are a class-based society still, no matter what they think. And it seems so surreal to have like somebody who's upper class with an upper class accent saying that they're oppressed, when I came from like one of the most disadvantaged backgrounds. I'm pretty sure that most white working class people would be in the same boat as me, saying, what are you doing? What are you saying to me from up there? Like, you know, when I'm down here, you know, and it's a fair point to make.
Well, Tarjinder, can I come back, Inaya? Is that okay? I agree with you, Tarjinder, but I think you've got to, what their response to that is, and it does have a certain appeal, not a widespread appeal, I agree. I think most people are far too commonsensical to go along with this, but there is a significant layer of our cultural, academic, educational, public institutions to which this appeals to, and it appeals to precisely because they say, yes, we do have privilege. That's why we have a responsibility to speak for the people that don't have the voice. So it's an ethical imperative, right? And people, in a way, it speaks to the fact that for quite a long time, there's been a lack of ethical discourse in public politics and in public policy making. It's been so technocratic that people, I think there's a kind of starvation of any kind of, we've kind of lost the practice of moral thinking and working out things from a moral positioning. So when somebody comes along and says, yes, I might be privileged, you know, when Afua Hirsch or any other lodge comes along and, you know, they're all entirely very well connected and, you know, had, all, as you say, very, very educated, they've got their own networks, which is what has happened. I mean, conservative people have that as well. It's not just left-wing people. So they, you know, and they come along and then they want to present themselves as speaking for the underdogs. But it's precisely the job of the guardians of truthful knowledge, of academic knowledge, or not solely academic knowledge, educational knowledge in schools, the media, to question that. You know, they're saying Great Britain's a racist country. Well, you know, we can't just take their word for it, right? They're not divine beings. And, you know, we are not in a religious society. We need some kind of logical or empirical proof, right? Or some justification for that claim. Now, they don't really have it. And that's the problem. The reason they don't, and that's one of the reasons why they're so hostile to disciplinary knowledge and criteria of, they want to dismantle objectivity. You know, there was that list that says signs of bias include objectivity, include grammar, include all the tools by which we can communicate and try and build solidarity beyond those who experience the same thing as us. So it's very solipsistic and very inward looking and authoritarian in its implications, because the only way it will win is through excluding and policing and delegitimizing a whole swathe of people.
I think just to back that up, to add to what Alka was saying, you know, about institutional racism in schools or in education, I don't think it's the case, but I also think, like Alka was saying, we need to be evidence informed. Everything we do in education should be backed up by evidence where possible. And when we look at the evidence, we see that, you know, like I talked about, Black African kids are doing better than white British kids, but also Black and Asian students are nearly twice more likely to get into university than white British kids. So the evidence is actually against the claim, and that's why they don't want to look at any evidence-informed nature, because it won't back up their argument.
So Tarjinder, you talked about, you know, being concerned about the impact this will have, you know, on children in terms of, you know, thinking about race and being conscious of race. Do you disagree with the idea that, for example, as a primary school teacher, that, you know, primary school age kids should be thinking about their race and how that might impact them within society, as in preparing them for what they may face in wider society? Or do you think that we should be having a colourblind approach, or an approach that, you know, doesn't even acknowledge race within the primary school structure?
You see, this is what I don't understand, because like ever since I started teaching about teaching in primary schools, I don't think I adopted ever a colourblind approach. I think I adopted like a colour approach, and therefore just went, okay, so we all have our skin colours, and as far as I can understand, like, you know, from my own perspective, like from teaching very young children, how far do I go with that? Because all I can really say is that we're from different parts of the world, and then it disappears, right? What actually is important is ethno-national culture, and it's culinary, and it's tradition, and it's how we act, it's what we dress like. I'm sorry, but skin colour holds very little explanation in this world. So the whole idea of race, to some extent, falls apart quite quickly if you try and teach it. Mm. I'm sorry, I don't know how, like, what else to say about it. You can go down that route, but it doesn't hold very long.
I think the thing is, when people talk about colour blindness, it's kind of assumed that means that they're taking a very literal sense, like, oh, you mean you don't see me? I'm brown, you don't see me, or, you know, this is my cultural experience or my personal experience, and you don't see that, you don't recognise that. But that's misunderstanding what colour blindness is. It's a metaphor, and it's really one that is using those physical terms, colour blindness, to really make an ethical point, which is that, you know, legally and morally, your skin colour doesn't count. It's as simple as that. Now, that doesn't mean that you then can't see, that you don't see people's colour and you don't recognise their experiences of different cultures. And when it comes to teaching, I mean, my own experiences as I've taught and I continue to teach primary school children. They're mainly Bengalis and they're mainly young boys. And I teach Pippi Longstocking, which is a story about a Scandinavian, very white-skinned girl with bright orange hair. And they absolutely love it, because the thing is what the decolonists don't realise is that we all have imaginations. And if you have a good book, the imagination is hooked. And these kids are interested not in Pippi's skin colour and whether it relates to them or whether they see themselves in this rural setting. Most of them live in inner city London, but they're interested in the kind of escapades and the kind of inner psychic, you know, psychological feelings and motivations of the characters, right? And that's what literature is. That's what good literature is about. And you can, in a good book, anyone of any colour can see themselves in it.
Sorry, can I just jump in? I think I feel the same way about history, because that's my background. And I just genuinely think that, you know, we just happen to have been born into a country where the vast majority, like I said, you know, in my introductory statement, the early settlement was white, and they didn't mean to do it. You know, it just happens to be the vast majority of people who've ever lived here are white. And when you teach Norman history or the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings to any person, they are drawn into that because that's their history too. But it comes down to us as people to say back to them, as it was said to me at one point, that yes, you do have the history of your ancestors, which is understandably elsewhere, but you have the history of your own nation, and this is what it comes down to. And also, I do think it is it's so limiting to us as people and to young children to say the only thing that we should talk about is your race and your skin colour. Like, it's so limiting. They are so much more beyond that. If you teach them knowledge from whatever source, be it history, be it literature, be it geography, wherever it comes from, they can be drawn into it as long as you teach it well and you teach it from a knowledge perspective. Like they really do get drawn into it, as you know yourself, Alka, as you know yourself, Calvin. You know, they don't care in the end. They're just engrossed.
So, Calvin, I had a question for you. Obviously, you outlined many of the what you regarded as, like, you know, extreme hard left examples of what is being pushed in you know, Black Lives Matter and things like that. But what is the conservative response to that? Obviously, you know, there isn't a lack of conservatives winning elections or anything like that. What is the problem here? Why haven't we seen a more kind of forthright pushback against many of the kind of things that you've described?
Oh, good question. I think we are, but not on a national level. I think at an individual school-based level, for example, I would have more emphasis on teaching people like Tim Berners-Lee, you know, the British creator of the World Wide Web, so that all of my students can see an individual that they can thrive towards kind of the success, the entrepreneurial character, and contributing to the global stage, regardless of the race or creed or ethnicity or whatever. So I would push that on a local level. I don't know how we're combating it nationally and politically. I think cultural issues aren't political issues. They're down to the individual. I think the silent majority are small c conservative, as we've seen in the last election. People don't necessarily fall prey to this woke stuff. It's very much a Westminster bubble, a metropolitan liberal elites bubble. And I think most normal people with common sense kind of ignore this and hope it will go away. But that's the problem, in that it's not going away. It's becoming more prominent, and we need to develop a way of fighting against it. I don't think we have one yet.
So I guess a question to the panelists: why do you think so many people, like Black Lives Matter, the decolonize the curriculum movement, at least amongst, according to some polls, demonstrate it is relatively popular, if not the details, but at least the headline of decolonizing the curriculum is regarded as quite popular? Why do you think so many young people in particular, but definitely activists, feel so strongly that the curriculum is misrepresenting them, is marginalizing them, is alienating them? It surely cannot come out of nowhere.
I do think it comes from a particular place where young children have been taught to think about their feelings. It's come from a very therapeutic approach towards education. And I'm sorry to say, but quite a lot of them are quite narcissistic. Like when I approach them, I just think, you're a bit narcissistic. Like, you only think about yourself, and you think, well, why is this curriculum not being personalized towards myself? And I just kind of, all I can do is, like, you know, retreat back a little bit and then go, well, we do have a national curriculum for the whole of this society, and it can't be towards you personally. And I think we need to think a little bit more, not just about the curriculum and how we teach things on the curriculum, but also, you know, there has to be a point where we say, where is the family? Where is the community in all this, right? You know, when it comes to learning about history or one's background, where are they? Because mine were there. And I think that's missing. And I think that's a conversation that is difficult to have, and people don't want to have it. But I was having it with, like, a friend of mine yesterday, and I was just saying, well, you know, I was brought up on, like, so many, like, you know, I wasn't brought up in terms of myself, only in relation to white people. And this is a thing that I worry about, when they focus so much on empire, and they focus so much on, like, British society and themselves towards white people. I think, but why are you only there? Why do you only exist in relation to white people and not just within yourself? You know, why have you got no sense of yourself, regardless of, like, race? And that is kind of worrying. And if we start teaching that on the curriculum, I worry about that quite a lot. Because I'm more than happy to teach Black history, Asian history, whatever, like, you know, on the curriculum. But what I don't want to teach them is that, and I don't want to teach white children this either, that the only thing that's important about you is how you related during this one period of history towards each other during, like, 200 years. Because there's so much more to them, to all of them, than this, you know. And I think it needs to be recognised.
I mean, I think Tarjinder, I would agree that you know, the therapeutic education is a large component in this. But in a way, that does kind of beg the question of why have we been teaching them therapeutic education for so long? Why has education taken this turn? And that's where I think you do need to kind of go back to really first principles, and which you have to start off with, well, what do we see education's main aim as being? What is its goal? And the truth here, once you start asking that question, is that political parties of both left and right since the 1970s have completely abandoned the idea that education has any value of its own in its own sake, right? It has been instrumentalized first for economic reasons, and that was Cowher's Ruskin speech in '76. And then on top of that, you've had each decade or each half a decade, you've had different kinds of instrumentalism layered in on top of that. And they don't kind of discount, they don't negate each other, they just kind of merge into a mush. So literally today, what we've got is on the one side, and we've seen the fiasco of what kind of imposing a mindless algorithm, standards, obsessed form of education can result in on the one side, and then the kind of complete moral absolutists of decolonising on the other side. And between we don't have education for its own sake.
But this is where we disagree a little bit, because I do think in the 1970s, and as well as I do, that like in the teacher training institutions, it has been the left, it has been the far left at times, who've actually had control. And they can't just like go, it's a right, it's a right, it's a right. They gained control over those institutions, and I don't think it was like, it wasn't a conspiracy or anything. It was just they were the ones who were interested in training teachers, so they did it. But what they did, in some ways, and I agree that both left and right did actually did kind of take a step back from education, didn't really realise what was going on until too late. But then both of them made quite a mess of the situation. Only Gove, as far as I'm concerned, actually tried to like take some control and say, right, this is the national curriculum now. This is what we're going to teach. This is how we're going to teach it. And try and put something in place. And we have to say that as a nation, we cannot just take a step back and constantly go, we'll leave it to one group of people. And to be fair, the far left, the actual far left, are not the people, or the far right either, are the people that we can trust with education. We've said it already about the far right. We have to say about the far left as well, like the actual far left. Like, I'm sorry, but only the moderates can really take care of education in this system and actually look at it and be honest and say, what do we actually need as a society? And then by all means, maybe our children will adopt these ideas. I mean, we don't like them either way, but we can't leave it to them.
So I struggle with this because I'm still not actually sure what Black history means and why we're talking about teaching more Black history. So to me, it implies that British history isn't Black history. So that kind of says, so what history is my history then? As a Black Brit, for example. I think it's just divisive, but it's divisive on purpose. I don't think it is that they're trying to stand up for a minority, because I never see any arguments to teach more Eastern European history. I never see the argument to teach more Lithuanian or Polish history, even though our schools we're seeing tenfold increases of Eastern European children in our schools. They are the biggest minority that is growing at the moment. So why aren't we seeing the request for that? Because they don't fit the woke agenda. If we look at the recent election in Poland with the new president being re-elected, Andrzej Duda, I don't think his principles would align with people like Black Lives Matter. So it doesn't work for them. So it's not about standing up for anyone. It is about pushing their actual agenda, which is things I talked about in my opening statement, breaking down of the family unit and against white capitalism and all these things. And it just so happens that anti-racism is a mechanism to get into schools and to push their resources onto us, because it's hard to fight against anti-racism without being seen as a racist.
Well, it seems a bit bizarre that Afua Hirsch and Rani Edo-Lodge and all these people suddenly have got their books and they want to shove them onto the curriculum, regardless of like any kind of scholarship. And yet there's plenty of Black history. And I think I didn't mention it in my like introductory speech or whatever, but the Historical Association itself, it has to be said, have gone off on a complete tangent. And their new Black History unit, apparently, is one that mentions 5 black case studies, or 5 case studies of black people in this country, and they're all entirely negative. And I don't think that anybody is going to buy that. Like, if you teach this on the curriculum, nobody's going to buy it. Not me, not you, not anyone, because it's just not viable. I'm not saying that things have ever been perfect for any group in this society, and yet the idea that you would teach this is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. I come up with 5 examples just like off the top of my head and go, well, that's wrong. So what they're trying to do is, I think they're trying to like build their utopia, and I think we have to stop this nonsense where we go, there's a utopia to be attained.
I think, I'm sorry here, but I do think that if we just carry on, you know, just going on about them being far left and stop them doing this, I don't really think we're going to get very far, because I think you've got to understand why it makes sense to some people. As it happens, I don't actually think they are Marxist, right? Because they actually completely, for a start, they completely obscure the main Marxist category of class, because they substitute racial discrimination instead of class. So that doesn't seem very Marxist to me. And also, you know, there is this, I think, well, you know, you asked the question of where's the conservative pushback, I think, Inaya. And I think, you know, you've got to recognise that the Conservatives' position, that they are bound to be ambivalent towards the idea of tradition, right? There's always going to be tensions within the Conservatives, and we saw that in the 80s, where it was one section of the Conservatives that actually formally legislated for multicultural education. It wasn't the hard left, it was the Conservatives in 1985 in the Swan Report. But the Conservatives are going to have this because they want, some of them want, you know, they respect tradition. They can see the meaning that it gives to people's lives. But at the same time, they are for an economic system that literally dissolved everything that is solid into air, in the words of Marx. So there's always going to be that tension there. And I think on the history question, you know, I think what is meant is, you know, I mean, I disagree a lot with David Olusoga, but he did raise one question that I think is worth thinking about, right? And I agree. I agree with you, Tarjinder. We don't actually know what's happening in schools. We need, for a start, research to find out what's happening. But nonetheless, when he says, the thing about the whole Black history thing is not the kind of, the main point about it is, if you talk about the development of history in Britain as if it was solely like directed from Britain itself, rather than Britain developing in relationship with several other nations. And I think one thing that has developed through kind of recent scholarship, through some of the better global histories, is precisely we can see these relationships in a much more granular level now. And there's a lot, I think, that can be used to construct a better history, where you're not negating the nation, but you're actually explaining how the establishment of nationhood politically was also the precondition for internationalism. And we need to.
I'm always going to like come at it from a different angle, because you got to understand, like 30 years ago, I was literally taught empire on the curriculum with like both interpretations, like both positive and negative, and I had to just like go for it, like, you know. And I appreciate that's like unusual. And then I was taught all sorts of like Black history on the curriculum, because that's what my teachers taught me. They wanted to integrate us within society, within the world, within whatever. And so I will always find it a little bit strange that I went back into an education system that is still arguing over these matters. And I don't quite understand why it's arguing it. And you can say that it's not just a far left matter, and yet the vast majority of teachers in this system are left-wing. So why is it that a left-wing profession that says that is anti-racist and has been like anti-racist in both the liberal sense and in this sense, still cannot manage what my teachers did 30 years ago? Like, I have to be like a bit like incredulous about this. Like, I'm just going, well, you could have done this all along. You know, and not just you personally, but, you know, Calvin, whoever, you know, we could have been doing this all along, and yet somehow we didn't do it. So why have we not been doing it? Like, why are we not doing it? Why have we not been doing it? Particularly when it was supposed to be towards the values of the very people who are in the education system. And yet it's been on the curriculum since 1988. So even though I was pre-national curriculum, since the national curriculum started, the Empire's been on there, all sorts of things have been on there. And don't let us forget that the ideology that is behind the Black Lives Matter organisation is not just about race. It has all sorts of elements to it. And it is a totalising ideology. So it's not like it's just one thing. You have to go along with everything. Otherwise, you're not, you know, together with it. So even though we're talking about race and decolonising the curriculum, and that's one aspect, and there's one aspect of power that we can be given as ethnic minorities in this situation, particularly if you're Black, the truth is you'll have to go along with everything in the end. So we do still have to like contend with the fact that we're not just dealing with one thing in the end, we're dealing with everything.
Thank you, Tarjinder. So I've got a couple more questions before I take the questions from the audience. So is there any evidence, this is to all the panelists, that diversifying the curriculum, you know, improves outcomes? Because I do wonder, like, is there any, you know, evidence that, for example, a young Black kid, you know, growing up in a society where they see Black people in wider culture, but when they're in school learning about Britain and the canon and all of those contributions, don't see people that look like them? Is there any evidence that that would impact them? What do you guys think about that? And also, what do you think should be taught, you know, in schools? Obviously, we've had a lot of criticism. What should be the overarching, you know, foundational principle that guides teaching in schools, if not to kind of, if it's not to build identity?
Okay, well, just on the first part of that, is there any evidence? I mean, I don't know, I haven't come across any kind of systematic review on that basis, but what I have found is claims from, say, there are some, usually it's largely London-based teachers, English teachers, who are calling for decolonising the reading lists in literature. They want Renier Dolodge and other people put on it. And they're saying that, you know, it's linked to the point I said about history, that, you know, people don't see, if Black kids don't see their experience in literature, they're not going to choose it. But that is just flatly negated by the stats, which show that actually literature is one of the highest, one of the ethnic groups with the highest take-up of literature at A-level, are African pupils. It's really popular. So again, you know, you couldn't use that as conclusive proof, but it does indicate that you know, that assertion doesn't really hold, or it needs a lot more investigating for that to hold. I mean, my view is there would be no, you know, if we understand education, if we really understand and value education for what I'm arguing it is, which is the introduction to the next generation of bodies of knowledge and the way and the kind of intellectual and imaginative engagement and work that is involved with that, then that is something that involves us as human beings with our capacities that are universal. So every child will be able to access that if they have a teacher, and if generally the school culture and parental culture and generally in society we value that. If we did, then people, you know, that's how generations like myself or Calvin R. Tarjinder, we've succeeded educationally with very white curriculums, and I'm very glad for that. That's not to say I wouldn't, you know, I wouldn't mind I would like to read more of Tagore. I would like to read Achebe in my literature curriculum, but my intellectual and imaginative success doesn't depend on that.
Well, I think similar. You asked what evidence is there at the moment, and I think, like Tarjinder said in her opening statement, we don't actually have much evidence of what is actually being taught in schools at the moment. So we can't really talk about what has worked and what hasn't worked. I think that should be the first point of research, find out how much Black history is being taught and if it is helping students with their self-esteem, etc. But when you come to say, you said, what should we teach? I think it's our job to teach the best there has been. And, you know, during the whole Stormzy versus Mozart debate, where I think it was Birmingham City University was saying that Mozart should be replaced on the curriculum with Stormzy because he's more accessible to young people or something silly like that. And I think we shouldn't shape the curriculum to the latest fad or trend. We should have subject matter experts design the curriculum, and it should be challenged rigorously, absolutely, but we should be teaching the best there has and the best there has been to date. And, you know, Mozart symphonies make up a lot of samples and a lot of how music works, how it's structured. I don't think you could say the same for Stormzy's music, as popular as it might be at the moment. And we've got to look at those kind of things, not just the racial, the skin tone of the author or the artist. And while I'm here, I just want to really quickly come back on something that Alka said, because I noticed someone in the comments discussing it, Kieran, I think. The whole thing that these people aren't Marxists because they're not addressing class. And I think the reason they're not addressing class is because if we look at the most disadvantaged groups in our country at the moment, it is the working class white boys. And that is politically incorrect to discuss. It's taboo almost. It doesn't help their cause. That's why they've weaponized racial tensions by saying, you know, we need the black curriculum. And again, that also identifies why they're not arguing for Eastern Europeans. And people have said, you know, we don't need to caricature these people and we need to move on with the debate. I understand that, but at the same time, it was, what's the art of war? If you know yourself, but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer defeat. So we need to understand who our enemy is in order to defeat them. And they want to break down our society and rebuild it in their image with their ideology. And that's very dangerous, and we need to prevent that. But where I do agree with Alka is where, you know, you spot on in saying that the Conservative Party is split ideologically on these things, because it's not small c conservative anymore. It's not conserving tradition. It's a liberal party with liberal progressive ideals. It's very centrist in that aspect. We don't have in this country a party at the moment that is small c conservative or socially conservative. I think that's why, you know, I was a member of the Brexit Party for the time that I was, because they stood up for these common sense values. And who is at the moment? I struggle to think.
Where I want to come in is just to say that when I was working, like probably the most white working class area in my home city in Leicester, I was able to introduce all sorts of ethnic minorities, and I was able to introduce Commonwealth and slavery and Nelson Mandela and all sorts of people onto the curriculum without any kind of comeback from anybody. And the reason why I had no comeback from anybody was because I loved history. I drove history in that school, even when I wasn't actually the history coordinator. So when I came back at it the way that I did, it was, as history coordinator, it was accepted. And as far as I know, there was no complaints, okay? So if there was, it was not, you know, I just never heard about them. But the way it's happening now is that people are putting things on the history curriculum because of what's happening in society. Now, I'm sorry if this is controversial, but there are people who I know full well who put on Arab scholars only because of what was going on with Islamic, you know, terrorism. And then you've then got the situation now where recently we've had these protests, stroke riots, like see it from what perspective you want to. And now all of a sudden we've got Black history being put on. I don't think we can put history onto the curriculum just because people have gone out and done certain things. I think we have to, as subject specialists, put things onto the curriculum because that's what we believe. And what I worry about is this: if we stick stuff on the curriculum now, it will come from a different source and it will not be seen as legitimate as it would have done when I was putting things on the curriculum, you know, just 5 short years ago, because I was a history specialist in a primary school. It will come from a different source and it will not be seen legitimate in the same way. And I think we do need to accept, like, you know, that when we put things on the curriculum from recent events or because of, like Calvin said, fads or whatever we think it is, they're not seen as legitimate in society. They come from a very different source. If a literature specialist puts them on, if a history specialist puts them on, they're seen as valid. And we do have to accept at some level that also we do live in a majority white country, and therefore the reason why we're learning about more white people is not by, like I said, not by design, but by dint of history. And if we're here, we just have to cope with it at some level. You know, at some level, you know, you just have to say, well, that's who's existed here for as long as possible. So why is it an affront to me, Alka or Calvin, that most people in this country are white for the majority of the time? It shouldn't be one, because that's where we live.
Thank you, panelists. So now I'm going to be taking some of the questions that have come on the Q&A box and from the chat. And so I'm going to read out a few of them. And so, you know, whoever wants to jump in and answer, please do. So we have, what are the panelists' thoughts on the push to decolonize standard English grammar / school spelling in schools and universities, first started in the US and apparently now wafting over to the UK? Another question is, how would the panelists suggest we go about challenging institutions, especially universities that have adopted the decolonize ideology? And state education has become very politicized, notably by the left. How do we depoliticize education? So a lot of this is like, you know, what are the practical solutions that we can do going forward, really?
So I'll jump in. I like your question, Danny. I wrote an article on this today in the Telegraph. I think it's vitally important because we're getting to a point now where academics in the UK are saying that, you know, to correct a pupil's grammar is punitive, discriminatory and oppressive and or racist. And I think that's ridiculous. It's our job as teachers to ensure that all of our pupils have the knowledge and skills that are required to express themselves fluently, whether that's, you know, grammatically correct in speech or in text. And to say otherwise is lowering standards and lowering expectations, and that is bigoted behaviour. Like I said earlier, we have to raise standards for all pupils. I find this whole thing very offensive, to be honest with you.
I'm not about to. Sorry,
one at a time. Alka?
I agree. You need to. But I do also think what we need is really we really need educators. We need to up our game, right? We really need to up our game. Grammar is not sheet after sheet after sheet, right, of decontextualized exercises. I have young kids coming to me saying, can I do pre-fronted adverbials, miss? Can we do that this week? And I say, well, can you pass this sentence for me? And they can't. They can't pass it. They can't do the basics. And they're being, so there's this kind of fetishization of grammar from right and left. The left see it as totally oppressive and the right see it as the thing that's going to get them, you know, that's going to be a kind of key to success. It won't do it. It's not either of those things, right? It's fundamentally, it's so linked to how we make meaning, how we make our thoughts meaningful and how we communicate our inner thoughts to people. And it's a fascinating thing. And if we had an education system, if we had a government that valued education and was prepared to put the resources, financial and kind of cultural resources, into upping the teacher education, so we had teachers who really understood grammar and could make it the exciting, living, vivid thing that it is, you know, it just, this whole thing just, you know, kind of, it might not disappear because it isn't actually an educational thing. As we said, it's a political thing, but we'd be in a much stronger place educationally to just say, look, just go and take your politics with other citizens on an equal footing. Keep it away from an area where we're not dealing with equals, right? We're adults and kids, or adults and young people.
I think for me, like the problem that I have sometimes, I agree, the right can be too rigid on all of this, but the left don't give you a starting point. Okay, they almost, it's like sometimes they're like, if you have a starting point at all, that'll be the end point. And it's like, okay, we don't have to make the starting point the end point. So coming from a primary perspective, I'm just going, okay, I have to start somewhere. I have to start somewhere. And as long as we have a curriculum that develops children with their grammar, with their speech, and as long as it goes somewhere, and they understand standard English as well as non-standard English, and also don't forget that I grew up with a language at home and at school, and I find it really bizarre that when I went to Saturday school to learn Punjabi, I was being taught standard Punjabi, and that's not racist, that's fine. But if I'm taught standard English in school, that is racist. That just seems really kind of crazy to me. There's there's definite double standards there already. Okay, we can learn all sorts of different languages and standards, both as part of schooling and in terms of our writing and all the rest of it. But at some point, we do have to communicate with each other. Okay, and this is the problem that we have, is that if we go down the dialect route or the non-standard route, then we can't necessarily all understand each other. So we do have standard languages and standard expressions of whatever language it is, be it English, be it Punjabi, be it Igbo, be it whatever. You know, like we just do have standard, you know, expressions of these things. And that's only because we need to have a standard version. But we can learn that without denigrating ourselves personally or anything else. It's just that if you're the person who comes from, like, particularly like me, from a poorer background, and you don't have access to that standard version, then you're the one who's worse off. The people who are better off are the people who have standard, like, access to that standard English and can get standard whatever. And me, I'm deprived because I've got no other way to get accessing it other than school. So
I think it's also worth pointing out. Sorry.
Sorry, okay.
Yep. Okay. Okay.
Can I just quickly point out that I think it's worth pointing out that those who are criticising standard grammar for being oppressive are really historically ignorant, right? They're really showing their historical illiteracy because, you know, in a lot of former colonies, India included, and also Chinua Achebe wrote about this in the 60s. I think he did change his mind later, but that was for other reasons. The fact is that you have countries which are vast, with a vast number of different regions with people speaking different dialects. In their political struggle for independence and to modernize and to enter the world stage with a hope of developing and becoming equals, they needed English, right? English for, you know, like you said, it's just a fact, whether you like it or you don't like it. That was the kind of lingua franca of business and the administration and the institutions that were there. And after decolonisation, it was used by people fighting for independence to organise themselves. They couldn't have done it in India if they were speaking, you know, the 300 odd dialects that they had. And even today in India, you have Dalit organisations who are arguing that they want English to be the main language in all the institutions, because they're pushing back against the Hindutva push at the moment in India. So, you know, it's just it's very historically illiterate as well as illogical to think that something that makes shared communication and solidarity possible is oppressive. I mean, it's just stupid.
A few more questions before we end. So, to the panelists, do the panelists think that academic history serves a different function to school history? Do you see this as relevant to the debate about decolonising the curriculum? And somebody has put forward the idea that perhaps some of this problem has something to do with abolishing grammar schools and the assisted places scheme. What do the panelists think of that idea? And then once you've answered those questions, I'll put one final question to the panelists before we close.
I think all schools should be amazing schools. I've kind of gone out of my way over the last sort of 5 years to make that happen. You know, I've gone out to Great Yarmouth. I think that grammar schools and assisted places are all very well, but I do think that every child deserves to have the access to the education that everybody else has as well. I don't think we can keep restricting a good academic education, particularly in primary school, to just a few people. I do understand the call for it in secondary sometimes, and I do understand that there's a cut-off point whereby people might want to go for, you know, more vocational routes and stuff. But for me as a primary school teacher, I have to give the absolute best from like the start to the finish of primary school. I don't think there's any way around that. And in terms of what we teach and how we teach it, well, we've just got to teach the absolute best that we know how, and we should have those internal debates and discussions. What we shouldn't be doing is constantly going for fads, because what was happening when I was a teacher in my early years was that we constantly had fads and fashions, and we were just not like stabilizing at all with what we were teaching. And what we need to do is stabilize a bit more to get like a better standard of education. So what Alka's saying about various subjects makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. Like, we just have to go, well, what's the best way to teach this? And let's get the research in. But I don't think people outside of education realise what has actually been happening within education, which is that we've been kind of subjected to a lot of outside influence, which is not helpful. And I'm sure the others can, like, you know, expand on that.
Yeah, well, just on the academic history and school history and the relationship between the two, they're not the same thing at all. Academic knowledge in any discipline is where knowledge is produced and progressed, where problems in existing knowledge are found and worked upon collectively. And it's there are various disciplinary processes through which that happens, and they differ according to different areas of study. Now, the relationship between that and school subjects isn't, you know, school subjects aren't just mirrors of that, because at school you're not trying to, no matter how bright your 11-year-old is, they're not producing new knowledge, right? And the teachers aren't producing that. What they are doing is taking a selection of knowledge based upon the disciplinary knowledge, but it, like I indicated at the beginning, it will be mixed in with other things, and it will be sequenced in a different way that will be different to how you deal with knowledge in academia, because you're teaching the primary concepts within a subject to younger kids who aren't necessarily even thinking abstractly yet. You know, the ability to think abstractly takes a long time to develop. But that relationship, historically, it's been relatively close and informal, and it was done through the exam boards. You'd have regional exam boards who would be in close contact with regional authorities of education, with disciplinary, and academics would be working with them. And there was a kind of very stable network of relationships. So it probably didn't work great everywhere, but it was kind of worked for a while. But then that was very disrupted. That whole network and systems of relationships was disrupted throughout the 80s, namely through the Education Reform Act, and then through the changes in the exam boards. And you had a lot more new people, newcomers, younger organisations, more technical people. You had people who were experts in Bloom's taxonomy, introducing psychometric measures. And the kind of the academic discipline, relationship with the academic discipline just kind of got lost. And now you have people, you have the post office thinking they can write a curriculum for, you know, English in lockdown, and they've got a version of, you know, their English lessons for lockdown are just, you know, how do you feel with the heart, fill in this heart with what you wish for, and, you know, literally rubbish like that. You know, I cannot, you know, tell you enough how low the esteem of the curriculum and disciplinary knowledge is. And until that is addressed, we're going to have a very hard job providing a better education for everybody in the way that Tarjinder was suggesting.
I'll address the grammar school question, because I think what Joan said was spot on. I think we do need to improve our comprehensive schools, and I've worked in both grammars and comprehensive schools. It would be amazing, like Tarjinder said, if every school was fantastic. That's the aim, that's the goal. But I don't think we get there by taking away what's good already. And grammar schools were doing a fantastic job. Taking them away doesn't help comprehensives, just as getting rid of private schools doesn't help state schools. What we need is more parental choice. I think we have schools that are selective already, whether it's by postcode, or we've got performing arts schools, we've got sports schools. What's wrong with having schools that are selective on academic excellence? I think if we had technical colleges similar to what they have in Germany, they do that very well over there. We've never been able to model that, but if we could, that would be outstanding. So we've got different options for different types of pupils and different interests. There's nothing wrong with technical subjects. You know, my subject, computer science, is probably considered quite technical, but we need more plumbers and carpenters, especially post-Brexit. We need more homegrown talent in that area. So I think not everyone needs to go to university. That was a massive mistake by the Labour government. People are coming out of university with degrees that aren't worth the paper they're printed on. You know, we've got all these fluffy gender studies and things that don't result in jobs or any kind of employment or any future prospects. And by taking away grammar schools and assisted places, we've damaged social mobility. I think kids had great opportunities through those schemes. And I sense a hypocrisy here from the left, who are always arguing against grammar schools and private schools, yet Labour MPs send their own kids to them themselves. So I think we should give every kid the opportunity of going to a grammar and or getting assisted place. Open them up all throughout the country, remove the restrictions, and let more free schools open that are selective based on whatever criteria they deem appropriate.
Can I just jump in? I do think that what we need to do with primary schools in particular is that we need to like take competition out of primary schools. And the reason why I say this is because we don't need it. Okay, so maybe secondaries do, maybe there's a need for it further up. But if you think about it, if we can get 85 to 90% of children reading, writing and doing maths at like the most, the highest level that we can, and we do have the capacity, then actually what we really need to do in primary is a very different job to what people are doing in secondary, where they're teaching the subject specialisms. We need to get people in this country to a very high level of literacy and numeracy, and we can do it. And then where they go on further is a different matter. Like, and I know that sounds like I'm pushing the problem onto secondary, but do you see what I'm saying, right? Like, we have to think about primary and secondary differently anyway. And all of this all amounts to the fact that what we can do is we can develop the basics and everything to a really high standard. And what's happened for primary school teachers, what I don't think people understand sometimes, is that we've never really had the subject specialist CPD. We've always gone skills based. We've always gone down the progressive route, because I think naturally, emotionally, we feel that we should like build those bonds and stuff, as opposed to, and we've gone down the progressive route because it makes sense to us. But actually, we need to move away from that and go, we can have both. We can have the bonds and we can also have the academic route. But we need something different to secondary, is all I'm saying.
Thank you. So for our final two questions, I guess it's, closing statements to an extent. So in a few sentences, I guess, but you can expand a little bit. What are the potentially kind of dangerous implications for a race-based education system going forward? And if we are agreeing that this movement and this particular ideological imposition into schools is deeply concerning and problematic, how do we, from this conversation, how do we go beyond that? How do we challenge it? Not just as teachers, as individuals, what can we really do going forward?
Okay, I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think okay, so for me, there are two main dangers. One is a kind of social political one, which is that I think it's obviously it is endorsing segregation, right? It is entirely segregationist, and I'm a universalist, right? And by universalist, I don't mean that we're all the same, but I mean that I think every human nature is something that is directed by humans. It's specific to us as beings, that differentiates us from every other living being. And that's actually why we have a diversity. That's why you see diversities, because in different places and in different conditions, we, from our own volition, decide to organize things this way and not that way. And then we might change our minds later through all sorts of reasons. So it's a very diversity of our existence as human beings that actually, if you like, is philosophically a proof of the universalism that we unlike other animals, we don't adapt according to environmental pressures so much as the biggest motivation and factor in our adaptation and what we choose to do is our own inner volition, the Kantian categories of reason, imagination and morality, not necessarily in that order. So I think that trashing of universalism for me is really, really crucial. And the other, more specific to education, is truth. Is that, all this stuff is just based on distorting truth, and the only way they can get away with it is by fear, to delegitimize us ethically. And so the thing we have to do, whether you're a teacher or a parent or whatever, tax inspector or whatever, lollipop lady or whatever, is really, we've just got to dig deep and find a bit of courage to be as brave as we can in the circumstances we find ourselves in, and look for other people for solidarity.
Thank you, Alka. Calvin, do you want to come in?
So I think if we're not careful, we're already seeing on TES and the Chartered College of Teaching that resources are being put out there for schools to use that enforce CRT values. And we're going to start seeing more teacher training and more CPD using critical race theory as a basis, and it's going to end up stoking divisions, creating racial tensions where there are none, which could, as a result, damage the mental well-being of our young people. It could create a whole generation of white guilt and minorities with victimhood complexes. How we can battle against this and defend against this, we have to enforce the 1996 Education Act, which states that a balanced representation of opposing political views must be stated at all times. I think what you're doing, Inaya, with the FSU on challenging universities on the concept of free speech and that kind of stuff is vital. I think what's happening with the Don't Divide Us campaign, providing alternate resources for schools that can address racial equality and can address these hot topics of the moment without going down these critical race theory routes is important. So I think we just need to diversify resources and challenge with the law where it is there to back us up.
Thank you, Calvin. And final words, Tarjinder?
I think we have to remember that the people who believe in this critical race theory, in the intersectionalists who believe in this, don't just believe that we're socially, economically, and politically, unequal. They actually believe that we're morally unequal. And we have to keep reminding people of this fact, right? They genuinely do think, the people who are full on into this, think that we're morally unequal due to historic injustice. And that is not the way that we think about things. And even scientific racism itself was a break in human thinking, okay? All the way up to that, no matter what we were like, in group, out group, whatever, whatever we did, we always thought of other human beings as human beings. Okay, we veered towards universalism, like Alka says. And we have to remember that is our natural way of thinking. That is, no matter where we were in the whole world. So this is not a white Western thing at all. Okay, this is just us. No matter who we are, no matter what skin color, no matter where we existed. And we have to remember that this kind of race essentialism is a break in our thinking, and it's a break in our thinking that has produced no good. And I think we have to go down that moralistic route to some extent and just say it's produced no good. And as individuals, we also have to fight in our own institutions, individually, in our own places, and say this is wrong. This is wrong, and I don't want to do it. And it's a matter of conscience. And I do hope that more people will do that, just individually, because it will provide some sort of groundswell towards a different movement. Because while people feel they can't say anything, that's the biggest problem. While they know it's morally wrong, like while white people know it's morally wrong, but they won't say anything because for fear of saying, they'll be called racist. That's a real issue that we have. What we need is like all of us to combine, like in Don't Divide Us, in different groups, and say, actually, we know it's morally wrong. We know it's ethically wrong, and we won't do this to young children.
Thank you, everyone.
Can I just quickly say, I'm just going to put in on the chat thing a plug for a book that I've co-edited, the second edition of What Should Schools Teach?
Sure. Please do. We'll add a link to it as well when we put it up. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for our amazing panelists. This has been very insightful, very passionate, and a very, very important discussion on this very pressing issue. And thank you, everybody, for attending. And we look forward to much more incredibly important discussions like